Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone joining us from around the world. Welcome to the webinar, Unlocking the Potential of Biodiversity and Blue Finance. It's hosted by SBFN. I am the Global Coordinator for SBFN, and it's my pleasure to open the webinar and moderate today's discussion. With a membership of 96 financial regulators and banking associations from 72 countries, SBFN now represents over 92% of banking assets in the emerging market. IFC is the secretariat and knowledge partner of SBFN. Our collected mission with the members is to advance sustainable finance in the emerging markets. At Biodiversity COP15 in 2022, over 180 countries reached a landmark deal known as the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework to halt and reverse biodiversity loss by 2030. Biodiversity finance and blue finance are emerging as powerful drivers to support this global target. In the meantime, nature positive transition can potentially generate over $10 trillion in business opportunities annually by 2030. So in this context, SBFN members are increasingly seeking specific guidance on integrating biodiversity into the sustainable finance frameworks. However, transforming the nature and the marine ecosystem into viable financial opportunities continue to be a challenge, with a financing gap of $700 billion annually until 2030. So to set the market standards and guide financial institutions in channeling their investment, IFC has released the first on the market Biodiversity Finance Reference Guide and the guidelines for blue finance to address the drivers of biodiversity and marine loss. In addition, a number of pioneering countries are taking actions to develop biodiversity-related policy tools, including taxonomy. So today, we're very honored to have three international experts joining us to share their insights and first-hand experience for integrating biodiversity and blue finance into both the sustainable finance frameworks and investment. We have an exciting agenda lined up. We will start with an overview of biodiversity finance by my dear colleague, Irina, IFC's global lead for biodiversity and nature finance. The second session will be on blue finance, presented by another dear colleague, Push, IFC's global lead for blue finance. We will then hear from Mr. Wang Xin, Director General of the Research Bureau at the People's Bank of China. I know Mr. Wang from his role as the co-chair of G20 Sustainable Finance Working Group, for which IFC and SBFN are knowledge partners. So let's dive into the discussions. I would first like to invite Irina to start. Irina, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Rong, and greetings to everyone. Let me just share my screen very quickly. I trust you can see it. Right. So to get us started, I just wanted to situate where biodiversity, nature finance, and blue finance fit under the broader umbrella of sustainable finance that includes ESG categories: environmental, social, and governance. So the environmental category corresponds to what is very well known to all of us as green finance. That includes climate mitigation, climate adaptation finance, and now new and very fast growing biodiversity and blue finance. What this graphic on the screen doesn't show is that there are overlaps between all of these green finance categories. For example, you can find biodiversity finance and blue finance activities in climate adaptation in a project of restoration of mangroves to protect coastal areas, as an example. Or you can find climate finance in biodiversity finance activities, for example, in a reforestation project to generate carbon credits. So if these categories are essentially all green finance and they overlap to some degree, why bother with these different labels? Well, the reason is that differentiation between these different types of green finance allows investors to choose what outcome or what impact they want to highlight in terms of what they seek to achieve as part of their primary strategy and objectives. So I will be speaking to you about biodiversity and nature finance, and my great colleague Pushkala will speak about blue finance. So Why am I speaking to this audience of financial regulators and financial institutions about biodiversity and nature finance? Shouldn't I be speaking to the ministries of environment? Because isn't it about conservation work? That should be the purview of the Ministry of Environment. Well, the reason why is that financial sector is absolutely central to any economy, and biodiversity and nature are absolutely systemic to our global economy. In fact, our $100 trillion global economy is not external to nature, it's fully embedded in nature. So unfortunately, where we are today collectively is that our economic development model has led to unprecedented losses of nature and nature's ability to provide inputs and services that fuel our economy. What are these services? Examples include provision of water, food, pollination of crops, fertility of soil, regulation of climate, and many, many more services on which our economies fully depend. Loss of nature in one area compounds negative impacts and costs across multiple sectors. Recent report by the Intergovernment Platform for Biodiversity and Ecosystem estimates that we lose about $10 to $25 trillion a year across food, water, and health systems that stem from biodiversity loss. Let's just look at one example of conventional agriculture. The way we grow food today, we rely on the use of agrochemicals that over time destroy biodiversity in soil that leads to a drop in yields. The traditional response to the drop in yields is to use more agrochemicals, which increases the cost to the farmers, but also leads to runoff into freshwater and marine environments. This in turn leads to higher costs for water purification and increases health costs. The increase in pollution also destroys freshwater and marine biodiversity that in turn leads to losses to productivity in the fishing industry and decline in tourism revenue. And we can keep going with other knock-on and interrelated impacts that stem from loss of biodiversity in one sector. So the reason why I wanted to give you this example is that it demonstrates that solutions to biodiversity loss really lie in addressing the key drivers of biodiversity loss in economic activity. In our example, it's about transforming how we produce our food production system practices to reduce chemical use and to restore soil biodiversity through regenerative agribusiness practices as an example. This example also demonstrates that conservation on its own is just not enough and it will not succeed. For example, you can't save marine environments through just designating them as protected areas unless you address the sources of pollution that come from inland economic activity. So the key drivers of biodiversity loss, land and sea use change, pollution, overexploitation of resources, spread of invasive species, and climate change. And biodiversity and nature finance is about financing the transformation across all economic sectors to different models of how we produce and consume to address these key drivers of biodiversity loss and stop the loss of nature and eventually allow it to regenerate. And the financial sector, your role in this transformation is absolutely central. This is very much in line with what has been, This is very much in line with the goals and the targets of the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework that Rong mentioned in her introduction. It sets targets for conservation, but equally important, it sets targets for the transformation of the whole of economy to address the key drivers of biodiversity loss. These targets focused on this transformation the targets that are focused on this transformation include a restoration of degraded lands, reduction of pollution, transition to sustainable production practices, restoration of soil health, and mobilizing $700 billion per year in financing. These are the kind of goals where the private sector has a very central role to play. The reality is that the participation of the private sector in the conservation objective is going to remain fairly limited, given that this is not really a core business activity for the vast majority of the private sector. But addressing the key drivers of biodiversity loss within economic production is where the private sector can have a really great role to play. And the good news is that there are substantial business opportunities in powering this transformation. World Economic Forum estimates business opportunities to be in the magnitude of $10 trillion per year in transitioning food infrastructure and energy to nature-smart practices. More good news is that the sustainable finance debt market that you're all very familiar with has the greatest potential to deliver financing at the scale needed and in the immediate to support this transformation. In 2024, there were $1 trillion in issuances, and 47% of 477 billion in these issuances included biodiversity and nature-related use of proceeds, such as sustainable use of resources, water management, pollution prevention and control, in addition to preserving biodiversity. Just for comparison, in 2020, only 5% of the 640 billion in issuances that year included biodiversity use of proceeds. I have to mention that the key caveat here is that the amount of financing going to nature-related activities is not the full 477 billion. In fact, there is no easy way of knowing how much of that financing is directed to nature finance activities. But the key point here is that it illustrates a huge investor interest in this segment of the market, and that the sustainable finance market by far has the largest potential compared to all the other instruments we have seen for attracting private finance for biodiversity and nature-related activities. So to help grow nature finance segment of the sustainable debt market, IFC developed guidance on what types of activities would qualify under biodiversity and nature finance. The guide focuses on providing activities that can be invested in on commercial terms, and they include activities that address the key drivers of biodiversity loss in economic activity and generate biodiversity co-benefits, conservation and restoration as the primary objective of a commercial investment, and integration of nature-based solutions as infrastructure across different sectors. The guide builds on green bond and green loan principles, and it aligns individual activities to individual targets of the global biodiversity framework. Impact reporting is one of the key requirements under the green bond principles and green loan principles, and it is absolutely crucial to enhance the transparency and accountability in the market. So to help continue grow this market, IFC developed a supplement with impact reporting metrics for each of the qualifying activities. The supplement draws on the best available information in the market based on the market practices. It could be applied to individual projects, but also could be applied to assets and portfolios of projects. It is designed to be used for use of proceeds, but it can also be applied to help develop KPIs for sustainability-linked financing. And the metrics guide also addresses some of the key constraints that the private sector faces in evaluating impact of its activities in terms of biodiversity and nature. So it deals with challenges of attribution, the timescales, often restoration of ecosystem stakes 10 years and more, whereas for financial institutions, the length of funding is a lot shorter, and also data availability in impact reporting. Just to give you a flavor of what's inside the guide, what are some of the high-level subcategories that the guide addresses in terms of providing indicative list of investment activities. They include productive land use and agriculture. For example, activities there include reduction in synthetic fertilizer use, freshwater and marine production, for example, deployment of water conservation technologies, waste and plastic management. This is an example, could be reduction of plastic in product design, forestry and plantations. Examples could be afforestation with native or naturalized species, tourism, ecotourism services, and some other categories. The second large bucket of investments is conservation and restoration as the primary objective. Examples could include REDD+ projects or restoration of degraded lands with native forest to generate carbon credits. Freshwater and marine habitat conservation, for instance, watershed management activities such as reforestation to improve water quality and quantity. And nature-based solutions and infrastructure. Examples could include using constructed wetlands for water treatment by water utilities. In terms of sectors that are well suited for biodiversity and nature finance, based on our experience as an investor, we see opportunities across a number of sectors. And it's important to note that IFC's approach, IFC's guidance applies beyond the bond market. It applies to loans. And actually, the vast majority of IFC's nature finance is done through loans. In fiscal year 2024, IFC invested about $727 million in nature finance. That was our pilot year to start monitoring our nature finance investments. And IFC's transactions span across a variety of sectors: agroforestry, forestry, textiles to expand recycled yarn production capacity as an example, water utilities to create new sewage connections, and wastewater treatment operations as a way to clean up the local rivers, plastics recycling, engagement with municipalities for establishing composting facilities, investing in new technology to reprocess mining waste to be able to produce more metals and minerals from the existing mine pits, marine transport to help spread the invasive species, and nature-based solutions for solar production. I bet that you would recognize a lot of these sectors that could be in the portfolios of financial institutions. And last, I just wanted to give an example of how IFC's guidance led to the issuance of the world's first biodiversity bond by a private financial institution, BBVA Colombia. This was, IFC helped the bank structure the 70 million use of proceeds biodiversity bond. So it's a green bond with 100% use of proceeds dedicated to eligible biodiversity finance activities that are aligned with the activities listed in IFC's biodiversity finance reference guide. So IFC also supported this bond transaction with $35 million investment and advisory support to help build the capacity of this financial institution, to help them establish eligibility criteria and also set up reporting indicators for eligible activities. The use of proceeds is directed towards addressing the key drivers of biodiversity loss through the transactions that this bank finances, with a particular focus on reforestation, regeneration of natural forests, on degraded lands, climate-smart and regenerative agriculture, and restoration of wildlife habitats. So to conclude my portion of the presentation, I think for the financial institutions, there are great opportunities to build biodiversity and nature finance as a business line, and financial regulators can really facilitate the growth of biodiversity and nature finance within their domestic banking systems, as well as in the capital markets through developing guidance and taxonomies of where there are eligible opportunities for biodiversity finance. And IFC's guidance is designed to help you do that and grow your biodiversity and nature finance business. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Irina, for this very comprehensive introduction of biodiversity and nature finance. And also, I feel the urgency, and you keep saying this keyword, transformation, and what the financial sector and regulator, financial institution and private sector can really leverage this opportunity for both business opportunity and also helping the global target. Thank you very much. Now I move to my colleague Push and to present on the blue finance. Push, the floor is yours.
Very much, Ron. I hope you can see my slides. I'm very honored to be here and as part of this very distinguished panel. So thank you very much for inviting me. And it's great to share the screen with Rong, Irina, and Mr. Wang to speak about biodiversity and blue finance. Before I go in, I'd like to maybe link or at least address a couple of very key points that Irina mentioned in her presentation, which rings true for blue finance as well. Firstly, we're hearing a lot more about these thematic areas as compared to just green finance, or even, say, a couple of years ago, due to a couple of reasons. One is there's an increased urgency and focus on these areas. There's a growing recognition that you won't be able to address the climate change problem without addressing nature. You won't be able to address it without addressing water and all the other indirect and allied benefits and ancillary services that go with it. The second is the growing realization that the financial sector plays an extremely important role. There's no doubt, of course, that there is a large gap that needs to be addressed in terms of climate finance. They've traditionally been going into sectors that banks recognize very well, like energy or transport or buildings. But there is a growing, I would say, recognition of the fact that these, especially on the nature side, are important activities for the health of the economy, for jobs, for livelihoods, and also has an enormous social angle, as compared to just having a climate angle alone. And the final bit, which is important, which Irina mentioned, is one of the key areas to really address this climate finance gap is to look at capital markets, but it goes beyond that. So the reference guides, the guidelines, and all the work that we've been doing in this space, not only, of course, is for the capital market and makes sense for that in terms of scale, but also could be for any financial instrument or financial product where the use of proceeds are going towards activities eligible under the guidelines. So with that, let me take you into what we are seeing on the blue finance side. Blue finance is also a relatively new area, and we've been working in this space for exactly 5 years now. And it's been tremendous to see the kind of growth that we've experienced in the last few years. So we have seen a lot more issuances, a lot more labeled debt that is actually labeled as blue as compared to when we started out in 2020. And these reasons that I just mentioned are core and central to why we're seeing so much more interest in the blue finance space. If you look at the cumulative volume, we're still at about 17 billion. We're waiting for the data from 2024. But it is, of course, substantial when you compare it to where we were, but a drop in the ocean, literally, as compared to where we need to be. So if you look at the overall green sustainable market, which is over $1 trillion now, this is an extremely small part of it, but one with enormous opportunity. So what we do expect is that the rate of growth in terms of blue finance and what we would see would be much, much faster than what we saw in the green finance space, because a lot of it is in parallel and a lot of it follows the same trajectory. And you already have a number of financial institutions and corporates who are already well versed in terms of frameworks, issuing in the capital market, addressing sustainability as a business opportunity. So it's just a matter of diversifying or evolving from the present state, where the foundations are already built, into more innovative sectors and more niche sectors like biodiversity and blue. So one of the questions that we get asked all the time is investor perceptions. What about investors that are not DFIs or NDPs, just commercial or institutional capital? Are they interested in looking at the blue economy? And the answer is a resounding yes. So the drivers of this are interesting, though. It's not about portfolio diversification, which we always or initially thought was possibly the case. It's not about looking at incentives, but it's being driven by the fact that there's enormous ESG impact. A lot of investors now have ESG as an important part of their mandate that they need to achieve. And the blue economy is a space and an opportunity that they may not have considered before, which is now something that they're looking at very keenly. The other is the opportunity in terms of innovation and new technologies. There's so much happening in the water space and the wastewater space as well, also in terms of marine and ocean restoration, that gives itself into everything from, say, startups to the SME sector, to various players in the supply chain being included and part of this entire process in the blue economy. And also, of course, leading to that, our growth prospects. So investor perceptions are definitely very, very different to when we started, and very encouraging to see how positive they are in terms of financing blue economy projects. And equally interesting are the barriers to investment in the blue economy. You would have thought that one of the major issues may have been risk mitigation. or the fact that long-term funding is needed for a number of these projects. But interestingly enough, the major challenges are really around ensuring that the right investment goes to the right place, ensuring that you have the right kind of experience and knowledge, and also, of course, ensuring there are bankable supply of projects where funding can actually flow into. So given the opportunity that we saw in the blue finance space and the fact that there were no guidelines or a standardized set of eligibility criteria for either issuers, borrowers, or the investors to actually use as a standard document, this led us to develop the Blue Finance Guidelines, which was launched in 2022, and subsequently also did a guidance called the Guidance for the Sustainable Blue Economy with the International Capital Market Association, ADB, UNEP-FI, and UNGC. The purpose of the guide really is to draw on the green loan principles and the green bond principles, address SDGs 6 and 14, and give a common way of understanding in terms of what qualifies as blue assets or blue activities. One important factor to mention here is that when we think about blue, we invariably only think about ocean protection and marine conservation. And we were very keen to ensure that the water part of the equation is addressed as well. This is increasingly a problem in emerging markets and globally everywhere that you go in terms of wastewater treatment, marine plastics and pollution, and additionally, of course, access to water and water sanitation. So the Blue Finance Guidelines do cover both water and oceans as two main criteria or categories for financing. Oops, sorry. Within the guidelines itself, essentially the broad categories that we have are water supply, water sanitation, ocean-friendly and water-friendly products, chemicals and plastics-related sectors, sustainable shipping and port logistics, fisheries, aquaculture, the seafood value chain, marine ecosystem restoration, sustainable tourism, and offshore wind. I think a common question that we always get asked is this comprehensive enough for everything that we're seeing in the blue economy? Of course, this will keep changing as we come across new technologies. And I think that's an important, again, evolution that we've seen on the green side in terms of eligible categories that qualify under green. So this is definitely a work in progress, and I'm sure this will evolve as the blue economy and types of projects evolve as well. We're also, of course, trying to make the distinction, again, going back to a point that was raised earlier by Irina, on what is green and what is blue. For all practical purposes, everything blue is green. It comes under the umbrella of green. And as I mentioned, it draws on the green bond principles and the green loan principles. And it really depends on the issuer or the borrower or the investor and on the outcome of their investment or the outcome of what they're doing and how they want to actually position that. So something could definitely be a blue finance activity, but could be biodiversity as well. It could be blue and could be green as well. And this is not necessarily to confuse the market or to have too many labels, but rather to draw attention to issues that seriously concern a number of these assets that are not getting the funding or have liquidity, but at the same time ensure, of course, that issuers and borrowers are drawing attention to it or ensuring that it becomes a sustainable part of their strategy or business opportunity. Overall, we're very proud of the investments that we have done. IFC is, of course, also an issuer. We have done 2 billion in terms of direct investments in blue so far. This is a combination of blue bonds, blue loans. Majority of these have been with financial institutions issuing and IFC subscribing as an anchor investor or as a sole subscriber. A big part of what we have been doing, of course, is mobilization, bringing in other institutional capital, building that confidence in blue finance guidelines in markets where other investors may not have gone. And also, of course, opening up opportunities for FIs who never thought that this was an opportunity they should be looking at. So it's definitely been very encouraging to see the kinds of projects that have been financed. A lot of it has been water, wastewater focused. And again, taking this parallel with green, initially we saw a lot of renewables being focused because that was where the comfort zone was and everyone knew how to credit underwrite such projects. Increasingly now we're seeing electric vehicles, we're seeing climate smart agri and green housing, green mortgages. So again, we think that this evolution will come in blue as well, where banks will get more confident and more comfortable to credit underwrite more so-called niche projects for the moment, but they would become mainstream. And that rate of growth or the rate of change, of course, would be much, much faster. We were also very, very excited to see the response for our guidelines in the market. It's not only IFC using it, there are a number of others who are using the guidelines. And of course, having reached an important milestone in terms of direct investments, the next goal for us was try and see how we could actually build it out into a fund or a strategy. We're working with T. Rowe Price, a well-known and well-established asset manager in North America, to build exactly this, a strategy or a fund around the blue economy, which has both the financing element using the blue guidelines in terms of eligibility and framework, but also a technical assistance facility, which will be managed by IFC and could be an important part or aspect of this entire strategy. As we all know, of course, different financial institutions and organizations and corporates are at different stages in terms of understanding. And you may have noticed or remember the earlier slide where we said that this is one of the biggest issues that investors see in the market. So to help to kind of tide over this particular issue, also ensuring no greenwashing and the right frameworks are in place, the TAF will play an important role as part of the strategy as we go forward. And finally, just a couple of very quick cases to demonstrate the guidelines itself and the eligibility. This is a project in Brazil that has been done by the infrastructure team, essentially to improve access to water and sanitation. There is a great YouTube video if you'd like to watch it as well, but essentially the use of proceeds go into protecting natural water resources, urban water bodies, cleaning up the most important river in this particular area in Brazil, which has been a huge aspect of, I would say, not only celebration, but it's also been on the social and health side, a very important factor of where this project has led that community to by this financing, through this financing. The positive impacts, as I mentioned, improved water quality, sewage collection, one of the poorest neighborhoods in Sao Paulo, and of course, reduction in the river itself, which in turn has had, of course, a positive effect in the oceans and the water bodies around. Another example was on the corporate side. This is with Indorama, one of the biggest companies that we have in Asia, but particularly because they're involved in the manufacturing and recycling of PET resin. This was 100% of the user proceeds was used for this purpose. And this was one of the first that actually focused on serious plastic mismanagement and how to actually deal with that, and also take renewable energy as a source of power to do the recycling and increase their capacity. So this was the first blue loan that we had focused particularly on marine plastic pollution. And since then, of course, we have done several more that have drawn on this as well. And finally, this is an example of the first blue bond that we did with a financial institution at IFC. BDO has been leading the way in the Philippines, doing many different things, like even the first green bond in 2018. This is for $100 million, and the funds went to water conservation, wastewater treatment, plastics, sustainable tourism, fisheries, and sustainable seafood processing. IFC supported this transaction in terms of being the sole supplier, but also, of course, supporting on the advisory side as well. All the examples here have led to many other issuances and many other transactions coming to market, and we're also very heartened to see that the BDO Blue Bond also led to the regulators in the Philippines taking blue as an important category to consider, and they subsequently released the blue guidelines for the Philippines as well as a result of several of these activities. So thank you very much for your attention and for listening to the presentation. I look forward to your questions as well at the end.
Thank you very much, Push, an excellent presentation. And thank you for further clarifying the relationship between green finance, blue finance, biodiversity, and oral. And also, I really like this lot of examples and to really showing, IFC as also standard setter and investor, but also global convener, including knowledge sharing. So this is the kind of our role as a global developed financial institution. It's great. Thank you. Now, I would like to invite Mr. Wang to present China's experience in promoting biodiversity finance, in particular, developing the taxonomy. Mr. Wang, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Zhang Rong. It's my great pleasure to attend this very important conference. This is my second time to attend the SBFN conference. I always benefit a lot from the conference. Today, I'm going to talk about China's explorations in developing biodiversity finance taxonomy. And basically, I think you could ignored what I'm going to say, but you are strongly recommended to pay close attention to the beautiful pictures shown on the this PPT. Those beautiful pictures were taken by one of my colleagues, Li Peng's father, and the pictures vividly remind us the necessity and urgencies of nature and biodiversity preservations. Next slide, please. Next slide. Yeah, now China attaches importance to promoting the implementations of the Kunming and Montreal global biodiversity framework and so on. However, we all know that the lack of unified scientific and user-friendly classification framework and quantified standards remain a key barriers to mobilizing diverse capital for nature and biodiversity initiatives. Next slide, please. And actually, we have already had some catalogs and taxonomies for green finance and transition finance. For example, the Green Industry Guidance Catalog and the Green Bonds Endorsed Projects Catalog, something like that. But the relevant indicators are still not perfect, and some classification standards lack probabilities. And so we need to compile nature and biodiversity catalog, and this is what we are doing. Next slide, please. And in March 2024, the PBC, the People's Bank of China, formed a working group, and we widely consult with industry regulatory agencies, financial institutions, and local governments, and so on. And also we carry out a few investigations in various provinces, including Sichuan, Zhejiang, and Yunnan and provinces. And we try to figure out the framework of our catalog. Next slide, please. And basically our catalogs will be used by financial institutions, enterprises, local governments, and financial regulatory authorities, and so on and so forth. And with the taxonomies that they can define well the activities and projects, and so the financial institutions can extend loans and develop more financial products and so on. Next slide, please. And we have several principles for developing the nature and biodiversity catalog or taxonomies. Number one principle is the no significant harm. Basically, the activities and projects under this catalog cannot do significant harms to other sustainable development goals. And the principle two is the prudent utilizations. We try to make sure when we use the catalog, the interest of various stakeholders can be balanced, and we could ensure the different regions and different communities' interest can be balanced, and we can ensure the fair and just transitions. And the principle three is the consistency. Basically, our category will be consistent with the major frameworks, including the conventions, the biodiversity conventions, the Kunming and Montreal global biodiversity framework, and also the China's biodiversity strategies, and so on. Next slide, please. And the principle four is the risk preventions. When we use the categories to do some activities related to nature and biodiversity, we need to take necessary risk prevention measures. And principle 5 is transparency and certifications. And I think that's easiest to understand. We very much attach importance to transparency, information disclosure, and activities need to be certified by the third party. And principle 6 is dynamic adjustment. And we are developing our taxonomies, but it's not necessary the end of the story. So we need to continue to review and update our taxonomies and categories based on the changing situations. Next slide, please. And so the overall framework of our categories includes 4 major categories and 19 subcategories. The number 1 category is the sustainable use of biological resources. For example, sustainable agriculture, sustainable forestry, sustainable animal sustainable fisheries, sustainable tourism, and so on. And the number 2 category is the protection, restorations, and recovery of ecosystem. These categories includes protections and restorations of land habitat, ecosystem restoration, biodiversity management, and services, and so on. Next slide, please. And category 3 is the nature-based solutions. I think that's similar to the IFC framework. And these categories include the constructions and operations of nature or ecological infrastructure, ecosystem-related measures for specific problems, and so on. And the last category is other biodiversity-friendly activities, including biodiversity-friendly infrastructure, biodiversity-friendly mining, and so on. Next slide, please. And actually, a lot of good documents and practices, international documents and practices are our good references. Of course, IFC's guidance is very important. We also draw lessons and experiences from ICMA's Green Bond Principles, and the Green Loan Principles, and the EU Taxonomy for Sustainable Finances. And at the very beginnings, we compare and do a lot of research on different international documents related to biodiversity and nature categories or standards. Next slide, please. And now we are almost to finish the first version of the category biodiversity and nature. And hopefully in the first half of 2025, we could have the first version of the categories. And after that, we are thinking of do some pilot use of this category. Next slide, please. And during the process of developing our own categories, that we are facing some challenges. I think the main challenges we encounter during the compilation of the category is the difficulties in defining and measuring biodiversity conservation activities. We all know that biodiversity and nature activities sometimes could be very region specific, and it's very hard to tell exactly the characteristics of nature and biodiversity activities. So how to reform actionable and quantify the biodiversity performance indicators based on affordable economic cost, and in combination with ecological measures, is the main challenges we are facing at present. Next slide, please. To deal with the difficulties and problems, now we are widely solicit advice and inputs from experts with different backgrounds. And we are consult with other ministries responsible for management of different industries related to nature and biodiversity. And to make the categories more user-friendly, now we are drafting the instructions for using the category. Next slide, please. And going forward, we will focus on 4 points. The first is the capacity building and knowledge sharing. The second is the standard comparability and interoperabilities. We need to make our categories more in line with international best practices. Next slide, please. And number 3 is the innovation and financial instruments and services and the introductions of various types of capital, including branded finance, co-financing, so on and so forth. I think our colleagues from the IFC have given us a very good pictures on the financial products and financial services development. And I think after we released these categories and taxonomies, and financial institutions will use them to develop their own innovative financial products and services. Last but not least, we will promote the integrations of biodiversity finance into the global agenda and make biodiversity finance an indispensable part of the sustainable finance policy framework. Now, in our G20 Sustainable Finance Working Group, we are more and more touching upon the nature and biodiversity issues. I think this is a clear chance. Let's work on that. That's my brief presentations. I very much look forward to your questions and our discussions. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Wang. You said it's brief presentation, but actually really comprehensive. And I have to say the pictures are really beautiful. And you said the first picture really give this, you mentioned the 2 words, the urgency and also the necessity really to protect our biodiversity and also explore the opportunity. And I found the 6 principles and also the 4 categories are really comprehensive. I'm really looking forward when the taxonomy will be launched. I think will provide a great reference for regulators and the financial sector, and as also with your leadership in the G20. And I think that's a great example from country and to motivate and also guide the kind of collective action in the financial sector. Thank you so much. I think and thank you all the presenters just on time. And I saw pictures the questions coming in, and also we also have a lot of questions when the registration. So I hand over to my colleague Teiko to facilitate in the Q&A session, and she has been collecting all the questions from pre-registration and also during the chat. Teiko, can you please take over?
Yes, thank you very much, Ron. Without further ado, let me jump into the questions as we have received a lot of questions today. So first one, I would like to ask Irina. Biodiversity finance is a new emerging area compared to other climate and sustainability related areas. Wonder what has been the appetite from international investors as well as the MDBs to finance such projects in emerging markets? That's the first question to Irina.
Thank you, Taeko. So the biodiversity and nature finance is perhaps one of the fastest growing area of green finance, as evidenced by increasing number of biodiversity nature related use of proceeds used in increasing number of issuances in sustainable debt market. As an example, we have seen tremendous growth in the biodiversity and nature related equity funds as an example. So the interest is enormous. I can speak for IFC and our colleagues at the World Bank in terms of where we are as an MDB community prioritizing this agenda. During Glasgow COP, I can't remember the number, I think it was COP 26, all of the MDBs signed a joint statement on nature, which commits all of our institutions to increase investing in nature. In response, the World Bank Group developed a methodology for tracking nature finance in our portfolios. So I mentioned already that IFC started applying this methodology last fiscal year to establish a baseline. For us, it was 727 million of transactions in that year that had biodiversity and nature related finance. And, you know, for our colleagues from the World Bank, the number is multitude of that. So the reason why we started tracking is because we have committed to grow our investments in this area as part of the broader MDB community.
Great, thank you very much, Push. The next one I would like to ask Push. Are there any specific mechanisms in financing biodiversity? Also, if there are any specific mechanism in blue finance? No, this includes both, but if you can share your perspectives and provide.
Thank you, Michael. So I think this is a really interesting question and one that we get asked often enough, I'm sure. But I think what we've seen so far in the market is a couple of important things happening. Firstly, there's a lot of sovereign bond issuances that are happening around the nature finance space. We've seen some in blue, some being contemplated in biodiversity, a lot being done, of course, in the green finance space that somehow, of course, envelop these themes as well. The second is that I think the financial sector is taking a lead in a number of these themes as well, with FIs going ahead and issuing bonds, for example, where the use of proceeds could be any type of project that come under these categories or themes. And of course, increasingly, I think there was a question earlier on, does this only apply to bonds or capital markets? Certainly not. It could be any financial instrument. So there's the mechanisms that are being done, plain vanilla mechanisms that are done for just corporate bonds, corporate loans, or FIs issuing bonds as they are, or anything that they're doing in the financial product space. As long as the use of proceeds are going towards these thematic areas, they would still qualify and they would be innovative nevertheless. So that's what we're increasingly seeing. And the financial sector, of course, I think is very cognizant of the fact that there are SMEs, microfinance institutions, several small players who come in when you talk about nature finance, and to ensure that there's financial inclusion and also local currency facilities available. There's a lot that banks are doing in country to make this more accessible for different project holders, bridging different project types as well. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Push. Now, let me turn to Mr. Wang. Okay, will the catalog and the whole initiative apply also to China cooperation with partner countries or only inside China? That's the question. Will the catalog and the whole initiative of biodiversity and nature finance apply also to China cooperation with partner countries or only inside China?
Very much for your questions. I think when we develop this catalog or taxonomies, I think it should be widely used for both domestic entities and for other entities, including foreign entities that are interested in our markets.
Thank you very much. I think that's very practical especially for those countries that are considering to implement similar initiatives. Now we still have time, so I would like to go through more questions. Let me turn back to Irina again. Another question that was received is, unlike carbon emissions, biodiversity loss is complex to quantify. How can financial institutions improve their data frameworks to better measure and report the impact of biodiversity investments?
Thank you, Tayako. It's absolutely true. Measuring biodiversity is a lot more complex than carbon emissions. And at the same time, I feel like sometimes these conversations about the complexity become so detailed and so, involved that it's almost like becomes an excuse not to act. I just want to pull back and go back to the key direct drivers of biodiversity loss that I mentioned in my presentation. Land use change, pollution, overexploitation of resources, spread of invasive species, and climate change. these direct key drivers of biodiversity loss that stem from our economic activity have been defined by science. So these drivers have been defined by the Intergovernmental Platform for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. And so one way to kind of deal with the complexity around the issue and what our guidance tries to achieve is to actually identify opportunities for improvement. So what kind of practices in economic activity can you implement that will be addressing these key drivers of biodiversity loss? I think we have to rely that the science is already behind that, and there is lots of science in the global biodiversity frameworks and global biodiversity framework, and one of the targets there is reducing pollution from all sources. So if we measure how the project interventions, project activities reduce pollution, and it's ambitious enough based on the industry benchmarks for that particular sector, that should be good enough at this point to measure our positive contribution to improving the state of biodiversity. I think the reality of the private sector, we often see companies operate in a very crowded landscape. It could be one of 100 companies that is, operating along the watershed. And there is really no practical way of measuring the impact of that company on the health of that watershed. But what we could measure is what improvement, what transformation of practices are happening within that company to reduce pollution. And we just have to say, because the pollution is such a key driver of freshwater ecosystem loss, that if this company demonstrate how much they're reducing that pollution, that they are contributing to enhancing biodiversity in that ecosystem, even if we cannot isolate their impact. And I would just encourage you to look at IFC's biodiversity finance metrics for impact reporting. We get into, we provide an impact reporting metrics for each of the activities in the guide that focus on addressing these key drivers of biodiversity loss.
Thank you very much, Irina, for comprehensive explanation. I think it is something that many financial institutions as well as regulators have challenges. So thank you very much. Now, unfortunately, time is up. So I would thank you very much for all the engaging questions and also the discussions. Now I would like to hand over the mic to Rong for closing.
Thank you very much, Teiko, and thank you all for this very engaging discussion. I feel like we need another session to talk about some of specific questions, but really please join me to thank all the speakers for the excellent presentation and thank the audience for your time and active participation. I see a lot of questions still coming. For anyone who missed today's session, and the recording of the webinar will be available on our website. We also note that SBFN continue to organizing the different webinar for different topics and also with our partners. And our next webinar is a joint event with IFC's Alliance for the Green Commercial Banks on February 27, actually this Thursday, that accessible for Asia, Europe, and Africa time zones. And the theme is navigating green taxonomies and the impact on commercial banks in Asia and beyond. And the information is on our website. So once again, thank you so much for our speakers and all the people joining us around the world. And we're looking forward to seeing you in our next webinar. Thank you very much.